Hello, my name is Bill Bowen and I'm a project management instructor here in Ottawa, Canada. Today I would like to talk about three very important but often underdeveloped sections within the project plan. These are the project assumptions, constraints, and dependency sections. In this video I would like to explore the purpose of each of these sections within the project plan, provide definitions for assumptions, constraints, and dependencies, along with some examples, then examine how you would present this information within a project plan, and finally take a look at an example of a process that could be used for managing assumptions, constraints, and dependencies throughout a project's life cycle. If you've never really examined the significance of these three sections within a project plan, you're not alone. While they're important to the overall project plan, they are often undervalued, overlooked, or underutilized. But they are important as they communicate a wealth of information and decision justification to the reader of the plan. They explain to the reader the framework of understandings that the plan was developed from. They convey the limitations of the plan and define the conditions under which the plan will be valid. Effective assumptions, constraints, and dependencies provide the reader with justification for the plan's priorities, approach, and rationale behind the decisions that were made. The aim of this video is to show how assumptions, constraints, and dependencies link together different sections of the plan within a logical framework. Truly, they become the logical glue that holds parts of the plans together. When first confronted with these three sections, many students simply identify the content that's appropriate for these three sections and partition up the information into what I like to think of as information silos that are isolated from the rest of the plan. In doing so, they overlook the purpose and the benefit of these sections. By using a simple house building example, let's explore how assumptions, constraints, and dependencies can help logically link sections of the project plan together. Supposing you were building a house, and one of the requirements was to excavate a basement area for the house, basically dig a hole. Your initial thought was to use explosives to help quickly break up the dirt and make the job easier. But you found out that the city prohibits the use of explosives within residential construction. As a result, you have to rely on the use of tractors to excavate the basement of the home. How would you represent this information within the project plan? You might show the prohibiting of explosives as a project constraint and isolate that bit of information within the constraint section of your document. Or you might feel that a new project dependency has been created between the project and an owner of a tractor. Or it could be argued that the information should be used as an assumption, as your schedule will now be based on the assumption that a tractor will be available when needed to complete the excavation. While each of these approaches have some degree of validity, when viewed in isolation, they do not reflect the full impact that this bylaw has on the project. Let's now look at the bylaw's impact from a project-wide perspective. Within the work breakdown structure for the project, we have a task that requires excavation of a plot of land. This requirement has an external constraint imposed upon it, the bylaw not to use explosives. This constraint means that the project has to take on a new project stakeholder, the tractor owner, who becomes an external project dependency, as we now have to factor this new stakeholder into our communication planning. This new stakeholder now also imposes new constraints onto our project schedule, as the tractor may only be available for certain periods of time. For planning purposes, we need to make assumptions about how these new constraints and dependencies will impact the overall project plan. And within our risk management plan, we need to consider the possibility that these assumptions we've just made may be wrong, and in doing so, we identify potential new risks to the project. What this example illustrates is how important understanding the assumptions, constraints, and dependencies is to understanding the rationale behind the decision-making and planning process that went into creating a project plan. As I mentioned earlier, I really think about these three sections as the glue that helps connect different elements of the project plan together. Having explained why they are needed, let's now begin exploring and defining each of these three terms. We can begin with assumptions. The PMBOK defines an assumption as a factor in the planning process that is to be considered true, real, or certain without proof or demonstration. While this is a good starting point, it does not fully communicate why assumptions are important. Let's see if we can add more insight to this definition. Assumptions are important as they define the underlying conditions under which the plan is valid. If an assumption is found to be false, then the plan loses its integrity and either sections of it or all of it needs to be revisited. What are these factors that you may need to make assumptions on? If relevant to the project, then you may need to make assumptions on events that might occur or conditions that might be encountered in the future, the change or continuation of current trends or the environment that the project's in, the validity of dates that you are basing your project on or other assumptions, what actions others might take with regards to the project. The key is that your assumptions need to be conditions that you cannot easily prove or disprove and are beyond the direct control of the project manager or project team. Let's return to the home building example that I introduced earlier and look at an assumption that might apply to a house construction project. Let's assume we have a requirement to build on a plot of land. The land is to be purchased a year ahead of the start of construction. For planning purposes, we've made the assumption that the condition of the land will not change prior to the start of construction. However, there are significant implications to our plan if this assumption has been proven to be wrong. As such, as part of our risk management planning, we'll decide to put an extra task at the start of our project to verify that the land has in fact remained in its previous state. We can also decide to put some money aside in a contingency fund to clean up or restore the land if needed, and we can research some options on who to hire to do this work if needed. Why would this assumption be a valid one to include in our project plan? It is for several reasons. It deals with the future conditions of the land, which is not something we could determine ahead of time. It has direct bearing on other sections of the project plan, and there would be real consequences to our plan if this assumption was found to be invalid. And given the nature of land, the assumption that it will remain in its current state is a reasonable one, and not one that's a result of wishful thinking. And as such, this would be a reasonable assumption to make on a project of this nature. Let's now look at a few examples of what I would consider invalid assumptions, and explore why this might be. Let's begin with the assumption that, for planning purposes, we'll assume everyone on this project knows what to do. Why would this be an invalid assumption? For the most part, this assumption appears to be wishful thinking, an abdication of responsibilities, or at a minimum, something that could easily be checked. Project managers go to great lengths to ensure everyone knows what to do, including developing a work breakdown structure for the project, using a RAM to assign responsibilities for tasks to individual team members, creating an HR plan, creating a stakeholder management plan, creating a communication plan. The project manager performs these activities in an active attempt to ensure that everyone on the project knows what to do. You should not assume people know what to do. You should make sure they know what to do. Let's look at one more assumption. The assumption that we can complete this project on time and on budget. Would this be a valid assumption to make on a project? Again, this appears to be closer to wishful thinking than a valid assumption, as it misses the whole point behind project planning. The purpose of a project management plan is to determine if a project can be developed within its constraints. You would not assume this to be true. Instead, you would examine the project, plan out the project, and determine whether or not it could or could not be done within the budget and the schedule provided. Another component that's missing from this assumption is that the author has offered no indication to the reader as to the potential ramifications that might occur if this assumption was found to be false. Hopefully this has clarified some of the mystery behind using assignments within a project plan. Now let's look at constraints and how they impact the project plan. Constraints usually impact either the business elements of the plan or the technical ones. Let's define project constraints and then take a look at examples. According to the PMBOK, a constraint is a limiting factor that affects the execution of a project, program, portfolio, or process. The key to constraints are that they have been imposed upon the project, and we as project managers need to find a way to deal with them. Letting the reader know that constraints are present on the project helps the reader understand why the project plan was created the way it was. Constraints limit our options, so if possible, we should always investigate legal and viable workarounds to constraints. But remember, constraints will impact our project even if they are undiscovered or simply ignored. As I mentioned earlier, project constraints generally fall into one of two broad categories: business constraints that affect the project's budget, schedule, or resources, and technical constraints that impact the project requirements. An example of a business constraint would be if restrictions were placed on our working hours. Such a constraint, while not affecting any of the technical elements of the project, would affect our project schedule. Technical constraints usually impact what options are available in fulfilling a project's technical requirements. For example, On these videos that I produce, a constraint has been imposed upon me that they need to be accessible from any device and with any browser. This constraint means these videos are viewable on a handheld gaming device, a cell phone, a tablet, or a desktop computer. But this constraint also places limitations on how I produce the videos. Students often ask me if weather is a constraint. For the most part, I don't consider it to be a constraint as it has too much of a variable nature about it. Constraints should be fixed. The way most students think about weather is that they've made an assumption that the weather will or will not affect their project. Making this assumption allows them to proceed with their schedule, budget, and HR planning. But it opens up the door to a risk that their weather assumption might turn out to be wrong. Therefore, I tend to think that weather, for the most part, can be handled through a combination of an assumption and risk planning. Having said that, it is possible for weather to be treated as a constraint. For example, where I live here in Ottawa, Canada, our winters are long and cold, and at certain times of the year the ground is frozen and outdoor construction work is difficult if not impossible. Since the timing of our winter with its snow and frozen ground is very consistent, you could treat this predictable weather event as a constraint, as it prevents outdoor construction for 4 months of the year. So in the case of winter, weather is constraining when outdoor work can be done. It means we have to prioritize our schedule and activities to ensure that all outdoor work is done in non-winter months. Again, I hope I have provided some clarity on constraints. Let's now move on to dependencies. There are 3 different categories of dependencies that I want to introduce. The first 2 are internal and discretionary dependencies. These affect our scheduling. The last one is external dependencies, which can affect several different sections within our project plan. Let's begin by looking at internal dependencies. The PIN box states that an internal dependency is the logical relationship between 2 or more WBS tasks or between a task and a milestone. Let's clarify this definition with an illustration. Internal dependencies are what we use to establish the predecessor relationships that map the WBS elements into our schedule, and we show these relationships within our Gantt charts and network diagrams. A simple example of a logical relationship or predecessor would be that you need to build the walls of a house before you can build the roof. Internal dependencies define what tasks need to be done before you can start the next task. There are 4 basic types of internal dependencies. I'll use the example of building a road to define and explore each one. The most common type of internal relationship that you will encounter between WBS tasks is the finish to start relationship. This is the case where one task has to be completed before the next dependent task can be started. While I don't know for sure, I suspect that during your academic studies, you'll find that most of the internal task dependencies that you will encounter will be of this nature. With our road project, an example of a finish to start dependency would be that you have to purchase the land prior to beginning excavation of the road. The next type of internal relationship that I'd like to introduce is the start-to-start relationship. This is where one task has to start before another related task can also start. A road-related example of this type of relationship would be that you have to start the excavation of the road prior to putting on the asphalt. Keep in mind that a road could be hundreds of kilometers long, so we do not need to complete excavation prior to starting the asphalt. The last 2 relationships are not used as often within academic environments, but they are still valid. These are the start-to-finish and finish-to-finish relationships. These 2 relationships are sometimes combined to show the full logical relationship between 2 tasks. With the start-to-finish relationship, one task has to begin prior to its related task ending. In the case of a road, it is clear that the asphalt work needs to be started before the painting can be completed. There is also a finish-to-finish relationship, which states that one task needs to be completed prior to another task being completed. In our road example, we know that laying the asphalt has to be completed before the line painting can be completed. By combining these last 2 relationships, we can develop a more complete picture of the internal dependencies between asphalting the road and painting the lines. The asphalting work needs to be started prior to painting the lines and needs to be completed prior to completing the lines. The combination of these 2 relationships form a more complete logical representation of the interdependencies between these 2 tasks. Well, that was a very quick introduction to internal task relationships or dependencies. Let's now move on to discretionary dependencies. Discretionary dependencies are also used in the creation of our schedule and are shown in our network and Gantt charts. But discretionary dependencies are different, as the name implies, from the harder internal dependencies that we just looked at. These dependencies are more soft dependencies in that they reflect the project manager's and project team's preference for how they would like the work to be completed or how they feel the work should be completed. They often represent efficiencies or benefits that can be brought into the project by performing activities in a specific order. Let's take a look at some examples. It is often possible and beneficial to add discretionary floats, buffers, or slack into the schedule without impacting the schedule's overall duration. Given the nature of a set of tasks, a project manager might feel that a project could benefit by adding floats or buffers into the schedule. This is often done out of concern that potential risks associated with a particular task might cause schedule slippages. And as such, they could add a buffer onto the schedule, creating a new discretionary dependency that adds some lag time between tasks and helps accommodate any potential schedule slippages that may have resulted from risks. While de-risking a project is one example of a discretionary dependency, finding efficiencies in the schedule would be another. Let's take a case where you're doing some home renovation and you wish to paint 2 rooms in your house. Using only internal dependencies, we might come up with a schedule that looks like this, where each room is prepped and painted individually before moving on to the next room. However, as project managers, we might see that it's more efficient to first prep both rooms, then paint both rooms. While no hard requirement exists to do the renovation in this order, it's just more efficient. Thus, the project manager could modify the schedule to reflect these soft, efficiency-improving dependencies. The last example of discretionary dependencies that I want to look at is one that reflects the priorities of the project's internal and external stakeholders. In these type of dependencies, tasks might be delayed or reordered based purely on the client's priorities or the team's preferences as to which tasks they want to do first. Often project managers will place a higher priority on doing the more difficult or risky tasks first and saving the easier or lower risk tasks until later in the project. That was our quick look at discretionary dependencies. I realize we're moving quickly through each topic, and I hope you consider this video simply an introduction to the various topics. I encourage you to review the course material and the PMBOK for more background. Now let's move on to external project dependencies. External project dependencies are people, organizations, or agencies that are outside the direct control of the project manager or the project team, but whose cooperation, support, or approval is needed for the project to succeed. It is important to identify these external dependencies as they need to be managed, and you need to inform the reader of the project plan that these dependencies exist, as they can impact the project and are beyond the project manager's control. Examples of external dependencies would be the inspection agency, whose approval you need, the subcontractor, who is working on a key deliverable for the project, the organization that holds the data that you need to proceed. Any relationship where the success of the project is dependent on the actions, approval, or support of another party that is beyond the project manager's control would be an example of an external dependency. Acknowledging and understanding these external dependencies helps justify some of the decisions that were made during the planning process. They can help shape your stakeholder and communication plan efforts. They can help control stakeholder expectations for the project, and they can highlight potential vulnerabilities of the plan. The easiest way to find external dependencies is to simply review your project stakeholders. By identifying who the project is dependent on and why, you identify project dependencies. Let's look at an example. Suppose you are running a project to build a house. Before construction can begin, you need a building permit approved by the city. You have no control over this approval process. This would be an example of an external dependency, and being aware of this dependency allows you to incorporate it into the overall project plan by accounting for the dependency within your communication and stakeholder planning, as well as your schedule and risk planning. So a quick recap on dependencies. I hope you can see why I think of them as a logical glue that helps to hold many of the project plan sections together and clarify for the reader why the plan was developed the way it was. I also hope you can see They should not be treated in isolation, but instead they should be accommodated and accounted for throughout the rest of the project plan. Well, this has been a very quick and high-level introduction. I hope it's been useful in providing some clarification as to why these sections are needed and appear within the project plan. So moving on, let's look at ways you can present assumptions, constraints, and dependencies within a project plan. One possible approach to identifying and classifying assumptions, constraints, and dependencies within a project plan is to identify a series of categories that you feel are representative for the project. Examine what assumptions, constraints, and dependencies have been identified in each category and structure the information within the project plan accordingly. Keep in mind, if you're working on an assignment for me, I'm just looking for a few good examples that demonstrate your knowledge and understanding. It is usually beyond the scope of most academic assignments to attempt to list all assumptions, constraints, and dependencies that might exist on a project. A different approach would be to examine each of the deliverables on your project, instead of categories. This allows you to map your assumptions, constraints, and dependencies directly onto your work breakdown structure items. Other valid approaches exist, but the important thing is to map what you've identified into the rest of your document. The key concept is that this information should not be isolated within a section of the plan. Instead, incorporate your findings into the rest of the document and avoid the information silos that I mentioned at the start of the video. We have now arrived at our last topic, and we can now look at some of the considerations involved in managing assumptions, constraints, and dependencies throughout the overall life cycle of the project. Identification of assumptions, constraints, and dependencies usually occur during the project initiation and planning phase, although identification can happen in later phases if some were overlooked or new ones encountered. A project manager should view their initial findings with some degree of skepticism and explore each one to make sure that they are indeed relevant to the project and worth incorporating into the plan. With regards to constraints, keep in mind that in general constraints are unwelcome restrictions on the project. If ways can be found to eliminate, avoid, or work around them, then doing so will result in more flexibility in the planning. Otherwise, constraints need to be accepted and incorporated into your plan. The next step is to assess the impact that the identified assumptions, constraints, and dependencies will have on your project plan. Scope, budget, schedule, risk, and communication planning are all prime candidates for impact. Having identified and assessed the assumptions, constraints, and dependencies, their impact now needs to be incorporated within the project plan. Remember, they should form part of the logical glue that links the various sections of the project plan together. Also remember that unidentified constraints and dependencies will not simply disappear. They still impact the project, so it's worth taking time during these initial steps to ensure that a thorough job has been done. Nothing is ever static on projects. Assumptions will be proven to be true or false, circumstances and situations will change, and the project must adjust and respond. As such, you need to establish checkpoints during the project execution where you reassess the project's environment and confirm that the framework that you developed your plan for is still valid. And finally, once the project is complete, a review of the effectiveness of the assumptions, constraints, and dependencies should be conducted and included as part of the lessons learned notes. The purpose of this video was to place emphasis on the importance of project assumptions, constraints, and dependencies as an integral part of your project plan to describe the environment, framework, and help prioritize and justify decisions and actions that you made within your plan. They convey important information, and their impact should be shown throughout the document. So to wrap up, if you're one of my students, please do not merge your assumption, constraint, and dependency sections within your plan, as I want to see you clearly demonstrate your understanding and knowledge of each topic. This can usually be done with just a few examples. However, your examples should be relevant, valid, and supported within your plan. With regards to dependencies, show your external dependencies within the dependency section of the template, and your internal and discretionary dependencies within your Gantt network diagrams. I look forward to providing you feedback on your assignment, and if you've enjoyed this video, please check out others that I've created.